14th, 1607. After a grueling 5-month journey, 104 men established the colony of Jamestown, originally called Jamesport, in the Chesapeake Bay of what is today called Virginia, and to enlist volunteers for this extravagant adventure, it was sold partly as an evangelistic opportunity. The Virginia Company's charter stated, "We, greatly commending and graciously accepting of their desires, to the furtherance of so noble a work which may, by the providence of Almighty God, hereafter tend to the glory of His divine majesty and propagating the Christian religion to such people as yet live in darkness and miserable ignorance of the true knowledge and worship of God." And 104 men signed up, with only one of them being primarily concerned with spiritual matters. One preacher, Robert Hunt, was the minister, and the colonists, they were not too concerned with the religious mandate of their charter. They were too bent on striking it rich. Many of the young men on this adventure were second, third, fourth, fifth-born sons who had not much inheritance coming their way, and so they saw this as their golden, literally, opportunity. And so their wealth was their desire, and the work of the kingdom and mission efforts was non-existent for the most part. So they spent all their time in endeavors of searching for and finding their great riches and wealth. And because of that, they did not have time, these men of such high status, to waste with things such as planting and tending crops. That was to be left for the dozen or so laborers to do. And as I said, because they were so consumed with that, spreading the gospel was not a concern to do with the locals. And by the end of the first year, they had to have a little humbling of themselves in order to beg or steal corn from the Native Americans. Well, one would think they would quickly learn their lesson, yet in the spring of 1608, a gift of corn was given from a local Indian tribe, and they used that as an excuse to not plant anything for the next year. And so no crops, nothing of any manual labor to be done, no cutting wood, no digging for water, no sanitation, no planting crops. That would violate their codes of dignity. And so therefore, they'd rather die than lower themselves to such a dishonorable manner. And what did they find in all of their searching for gold? Pyrite. Known as fool's gold, I think appropriately here. Well, they spent preparing for the winter of 1608 3 months loading pyrite onto the ships to be taken back to England, which would fetch them not much. There in the ships of Captain Newport, and he had arrived with men and supplies that January to help the colony along, which would be a continual theme of needing more help to help this fledgling colony survive. And when the James River froze over that winter, they were forced to survive the extremities of the cold in the burnt ruins of the colony, as there had been a fire set ablaze due to the carelessness of some of the colonists, so say the records. Well, on September 10th, 1608, things began to change for the better. For there was a young man named John Smith, who was named the president of the colony's council. Interesting looking fellow there. So, he immediately demanded discipline and work by all of the colonists, and he had wells dug, crops planted, and he declared that 2 Thessalonians 3:10 would be strictly enforced, which states that if anyone would not work, neither shall he eat. And that was the law of the colony. Captain Smith also tried to work with the Native Americans, because back in December of 1607, he had been captured while he was out looking for food, and he was brought to Chief Powhatan. And Smith feared for his life, as he should have, but he wrote that he was saved when the 11-year-old Pocahontas threw herself across him and, quote from Smith, "At the minute of my execution, she hazarded the beating out of her own brains to save mine. And not only that, but so prevailed with her father, I was safely conducted back to Jamestown." The encounter allowed Mr. Smith to build relations with the natives, which had been severely lacking up to this point, and they often rely on them for more food supplies or some assistance whenever they needed to save the colony. Because, as you can imagine, many did not enjoy the new conditions of the new president of the colony, these working conditions, even though things had started to turn around and improve for the colony. They actually had a corn harvest that following fall. But in the spring of 1609, rats and dampness destroyed a great deal of the corn supplies, so that set them back. To compensate, John Smith sent out a large group to go fish and to gather shellfish, when later that day they came back with nothing, saying it was too hard, we didn't want to work for this. He was a little upset. And so he demanded that they give their guns and their tools and anything else of value to the natives in exchange for fruit and other food supplies. A few weeks later, a surprise visit by a supply ship rescued the colony again, which would happen again and again and again and again and again. And Smith's demands had made him rather unpopular. So in the fall of 1609, a mysterious gunpowder explosion went off one night in the canoe in which he was sleeping. And I've always wondered, why was he out sleeping in the canoe in the first place? But maybe he was just enjoying the stars at night, maybe he felt a little safer out there. I don't know, but it went off, left him very badly injured. And so he sailed for England that October, never to return to Jamestown. With mosquitoes, malaria, tainted water, very misplaced priorities, self-serving relations with the natives, and absolutely no work ethic, 2/3 of the settlers died. A fleet of 9 ships was sent to help this colony, although they ran into a hurricane and it scattered or damaged many of the ships. Some of the ships did arrive, but they had lost many of their supplies, so now there were 300 more mouths to feed with very few supplies at Jamestown. And not to mention with John Smith gone, relations with the natives had fallen into disarray, and they would kill anyone who stepped foot outside of the fort. The Jamestown colonists had half a can of meal per day. They had to resort to butcher 7 of their horses. Some actually ate shoe leather that winter. George Percy, who became the president of the council after John Smith left, reported, quote, "Then having fed upon horses and other beasts as long as they lasted, we were glad to make shift with vermin as dogs, cats, and mice." That's a Merry Christmas. He even noted that there were some who had secretly tried to dig up buried bodies to try. From 1609 to 1610, out of 500 colonists, 61 survived. Have you noticed that this colony is pretty much just a Christian colony in name only? Well, in May and June of 1610, more ships and supplies arrived again to help this fledgling colony tried to survive. On board was a man named John Rolfe. Mr. Rolfe and his wife Sarah had set out for Virginia back in May of 1609, but theirs was one of the ships that got caught up in a hurricane. The Sea Adventurer was the name of the ship. It was shipwrecked in Bermuda, and while they were there, she was pregnant and gave birth to a baby girl they named Bermuda, but she did not live long after her birth, and so they sadly made plans, though, to continue on to the new colonies. 2 new ships were kind of constructed out of the remains of what was left, the Patience and the Deliverance. And finally, they continued on to Jamestown, but John's wife, Sarah, either died shortly before they arrived or shortly after they arrived. I'm not sure from the records, and so now John Rolfe has lost his entire family when he arrives. Well, they get there, and they begin to plant a new cash crop. You probably know it. It was called tobacco, and that was what was successful for them. His was a special kind. He got ones from the West Indies. It was considered to be sweeter and more flavorful and did better in the Virginia soil there, and so it became rather successful. They sent their first shipment to England in 1617. Finally, this colony's been around for quite a while at this point. They're finally starting to produce something. Well, in the midst of all that, in 1613, there was this 17-year-old now, Pocahontas, who had been captured by Jamestown settlers in the hopes of exchanging her for some captured Englishmen. Well, that never happened. So she was stuck there in the colony, and she began to learn some of the customs and the language of these Englishmen, and began to be able to speak English, and was actually, despite themselves, intrigued by their faith, and decided that she wanted to convert to Christianity. And she did, and she changed her name to Rebecca. Well, 28-year-old John Rolfe has, she's caught his eye. And he takes a little fancy to her. And he begins to talk with her and strikes up actually a very beautiful, loving relationship with her. And he wants to get married. He wants to marry Pocahontas. But there's a couple of problems. First on his list is he wants to know for sure that her faith is a genuine one. He made it very clear in his own journals and his letters that he would not marry her if she were not a Christian. Because 2 Corinthians 6:14 says you are not to marry someone who's not a Christian if you are one. It's forbidden, so he was not going to do that. The other problem was he's just a commoner. She's royalty. She's the daughter of a chief. So he writes a letter, I've got a printout of it on the display table back there, to Governor Sir Thomas Dale to ask his permission and his blessings if he thinks that their union will be a holy one that would honor God, and if it was okay that he married this daughter of royalty. Well, Governor Dale gives his blessing, and on April 5th, 1614, they were married. They had a son following January. His name was Thomas. And then the next year, 1616, the family traveled back to England to raise support for the continued work of the New World expansion. They arrived in Plymouth, England on June 12, 1616, and they had 11 others of her tribe come to visit and show what this was all about. There's a guy who's there who finds out that they arrived. His name is John Smith. And he's excited that they're there. He immediately sends a letter to Queen Anne, she's the wife of King James, saying, you need to make sure you visit them, you see them, that you entertain them in your court. Because John, the other John, John says that John is passionate about spreading the gospel, about the mission work there. And so you need to listen to them. And Pocahontas, Rebecca now, she is a convert too, is passionate about sharing the gospel. So make sure you hear them. And so they eventually get to do so. Well, 1617, John is able to coordinate his schedule with John. And finally, it had been 10 years since the original encounter back in Virginia. John Smith gets to see Pocahontas and John Rolfe once again. And so it was a really neat reunion between the two of them. Well, they decided to depart from England and travel a little bit more of Europe, and it wasn't long, though, that Pocahontas got sick in March of 1617. And don't know if it was pneumonia or smallpox or tuberculosis or what, but her health declined so rapidly, she passed away, age 21. And that's their story. How do you think things are going back in Virginia after they left? In total, of the 6,000 people who will settle Jamestown from 1607 to 1624, 3,400, just over half, will survive. That's how sad things were in Jamestown. That's part one of the story. Tonight's is just a little bit longer than tomorrow night, because I got to tell you, okay, tomorrow night will be shorter, so just in case you're wondering, you're planning your schedule, okay? Well, at the same time Jamestown was being colonized back in 1607, in England, Archbishop Tobias Matthew had begun raiding homes in Scrooby, in Nottinghamshire. He was imprisoning those who would not adhere to the King's Church, the Church of England. There was a group who thought, we no longer can participate in this, we must separate, must be separatists, led by William Brewster and John Robinson and Richard Clifton, who believed it was time that they worship the Lord according to their understanding and their adherence and faith to simply the Word of God and nothing else. Not the dictates of the king, but the dictates of their conscience. Now, it was illegal for them to just up and leave the country. You had to get permission for that. But they were going to try it. So they chartered a ship, and they got on board, and when they were ready to go, turns out the captain betrayed them and turned them in, so they were all arrested. Now, they were treated rather leniently, and it wasn't a very long stay in the prison, according to a very young man who was a part of that. His name was William Bradford. Well, they got released, and they decided the following year, 1608, they might try again. So they were a little more careful in who they hired as a captain. They said, this time we're going to split up. All the men are going to go first to go find a home, and then once we found one, we'll send for the women and children to come join us. So they proceed to do so. They get their ship, they get it chartered, they get on board, they say bye to all the women and the children, their kisses and hugs and everything, and the boat starts to go off, when all of a sudden they hear a lot of commotion going on back on the coast, back in the port. And they're, what's going on? So they finally hear someone yell that the officials are coming to arrest them. Well, they strike up in panic. They say, we got to go back. We got to help them. We got to save them. We can't let our families be arrested. The captain panics and just sets sail to get out of there. Well, that just makes all the men get all more frantic. They say, no, you got to turn around. You got to turn around. You got to go back. And he's finally says, okay, fine. I'll turn around to the back because they're about to mutiny on man. When all of a sudden, a storm just stirs up out of nowhere and completely blows them far away from the port. They can't see where they're going. For days, they were not able to see the stars, the moon, sometimes not even the sun during the day. They would be in a storm for 14 days. It would not let them go back. They found themselves off the coast of Norway when they finally all settled down. 2 weeks, the storm kept them from going back. The captain believed God had punished him for what he had done. I don't know if the Lord was punishing him, because if that storm had not struck at exactly when it did, we may never have had the United States of America the way we know it today. When the authorities arrived at the dock and found only women and children, they were like, okay, you're all under, you want to put the handcuffs on the kids? I don't want to. So they just let them go. They finally hear word back from the men who had made it to Amsterdam. And they sail off and go and join their husbands and fathers. And they're able to live there in peace for a while. From there, William Brewster, along with Thomas Brewer and Edward Winslow and others, they purchased a printing press and began sending literature back to England, criticizing the king and his church in relation to how well they were following the scriptures. The king was not a fan. It did not please him what they were writing. And so he began an international manhunt for these men. Started sending his authorities into Amsterdam and to Leiden and other places to try to find them. So William Brewster had to go into hiding often, was the case. And so there was always this constant fear of what was going on. Additionally, after 12 years of residency there, they noticed how much of an impact the culture was having on their children. Decided that was not good. Can't let the culture influence our children. So they thought, why not make a sacrifice and let's try for something new, the new world. Well, that's going to be quite an undertaking. They first have to acquire a land patent, which they do through the Virginia Company. Then they have to get financing because they cannot pay for it all on their own. And so they are able to acquire that through a company called the Merchant Adventurers. And in return, the Merchant Adventurers would receive a profit, based on what they're able to produce there at the colony. Deacons John Carver and Robert Cushman have to go handle all the negotiations because William Brewster is in hiding again. And the company, they're also going to send some of their men along as well to help make sure things are ran well. So, like Miles Standish, he'll be a military leader, and Christopher Martin, he'll be the governor of this new colony. And they all finally get on board a boat and set sail. The boat was called the... That's right, the Speedwell. Very good. The Speedwell was a boat purchased by the separatists. They sold everything to buy it, including their homes. So they're putting everything into this for the sake of their families. Well, it's not the best ship. Just from there to England, where they're going to meet up with another group of separatists that William Brewster had talked into going, they had rented a ship known as it's okay, you can say it this time, the Mayflower, yes, okay. And so they're going to meet up with them, and then they're all going to sail together, all right? And William Brewster insisted they bring the printing press with them, the big, giant printing press with them, even though it was currently broken. And the question was, to whom are we going to print stuff for in the New World? I said, it'll be important. We need it. Okay, fine, all right. Whatever Bill says, we'll do. So we're going to pack up the printers. And so they do. Well, the Speedwell had leaks. Some thought the mast was too big. It wasn't poorly done. And so they get there in England to meet up with the other group, and they said, we can't do this. What they decided to do then is, those people who had chartered the Mayflower, they said, well, we still have our homes. We can go back to them. Okay? And you all just take the Mayflower and go. All right, we'll take care of the Speedwell and get it fixed or sold or whatever. And so they do. Some of them, they'll go with them. And 102 of them crammed themselves into the Mayflower with about 30 or more crew members to run the ship. And they will depart Plymouth, England on September 6, 1620, headed for the Hudson River Bay of what is present-day New York. And yes, it was just a little bit cramped. And yes, they had the printing press with them. Along the way, a leak forms. And they realize it's down part of the hull of the ship. That's not good. So they need a jack screw in order to cinch up, throw this belt, this rope wire around to cinch up the sides in order to keep it tight so they can make it all the rest of the way. They don't have a jack screw. But wait a minute, there's this broken printing press on board that we just happened to bring along that they were able to disassemble and turn into a jack screw and save the Mayflower on the way. Well, that was just a coincidence, wasn't it? Land was sighted on November 9th, 2 months after they had left. When it was sighted, they all ran up on deck and began to praise God for bringing them to the new world. They were so excited, and they praised, and they worshiped, and they praised, and they worshiped, and they praised, and they worshiped, until finally, the Captain Jones had to tell them, would you please all go down so I can run the ship? Okay, so got right back down the building. So they did. And they arrived at Cape Cod, which was north of where they were supposed to settle, and was outside of the bounds of the charter that they had received from the Virginia Company. Well, they said, well, we need to set back down. So they tried to set back down, and a winter storm blows them back north. I said, well, let's try again tomorrow. And they try again tomorrow, and a winter storm blows them back north, and they can't get anywhere south. So they decided, apparently, someone's trying to keep us from going down there. And they sailed into Provincetown Harbor of Cape Cod on Sunday, November 11th, 1620. And since this was outside of the Patent's jurisdiction, the Pilgrims seized the opportunity to draft a new charter called the Mayflower Compact. Who's heard of that? Who's ever taken the time to read it? Well, here you go. It said this: in the name of God, amen, we whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James, by the grace of God, and Great Britain, France, and Ireland, King, defender of the faith, etc., having undertaken for the glory of God and advancement of the Christian faith. What was the purpose of this trip? The advancement of the Christian faith. And the honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by these presents, solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation, in furtherance of the ends aforesaid. And by virtue hereof do enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, constitutions, and officers, from time to time as shall be thought most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, unto which we promise all due submission and obedience in witness whereof. We have hereunto subscribed our names at Cape Cod, the 11th of November, in the reign of our sovereign Lord King James of England, France, and Ireland, the 18th of Scotland, the 54th, and we're done by 1620. Now you've read it. Aren't you educated? See, they have these men, there's 30 or so, who were not part of their separatist movement, who didn't necessarily believe the same things they believed. Yet they believed we could live and work together because of the grace of God and by adhering to His Word. And so they made this social compact together to work together in peace and harmony for the prosperity of the colony and for their families, and they did so. Now, with the next day being Sunday, they've been on this boat for how long? Way over 2 months now. They said, we're not getting off. You're what? You're not getting off? No, it's the Lord's Day. We're not going to do all this work or anything. It's the Lord's Day. We're going to spend the day in praise of our God. So they stayed on the boat another day. Finally, on Monday, November 13th, 1620, the Pilgrims set foot in the New World. It's interesting. My wife, when she visited Boston with her family, when she was a young lady, they went to the Mayflower ship that's been remade to look like her. And the tour guide said, well, they didn't really come here for religious reasons. Like, has that guy read anything those Pilgrims wrote? That's all he talked about. And that's why they were doing this, for the sake of their families. They explored the land.